Join former FBI senior forensic examiners Becky Passmore and Stacey Eldridge as they dig into the world of digital forensics, one bite at a time. Now leading their own consulting firms and educating the next generation of cyber sleuths. These badass babes of digital forensics bring sharp insight, real-world case experience, and a dose of humor to the bits and bytes that build today's investigations. From deep dives into business email compromise and ransomware attacks, Becky's specialty, to cracking the complexities of iPhone forensics, Stacey's obsession. This podcast delivers insider knowledge for professionals, students, and true crime techies alike. If you've ever wondered what really happens when the digital trail is all that's left, tune in and start parsing the truth.
Parsing the Truth one bite at a time is proud to welcome our first sponsor, Ace Forensics. They are based near Chicago and they've been building systems since 1983. Ace Forensics delivers high-performance digital forensics workstations, laptops, and servers to justice agencies across the United States and around the world. They offer unmatched value and the industry's only 5-year digital forensics warranty. Ace Forensics build the systems your digital forensics software deserves. If you're procuring digital forensics equipment, reach out to them for a competitive quote. Now, on to our episode. Welcome back to Parsing the Truth, one bite at a time. I'm Stacey Eldridge, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Becky Passmore. We are the podcast that focuses on digital forensics in today's modern crimes. And it's true crime, but with a techie twist. Becky, what are we doing today?
Well, today we are continuing our coverage of the first Karen Read trial. And we're going to continue to dive into Ian Whiffin's testimony, who's the prosecution's second digital forensic expert. And we're a little more than halfway through his testimony, and there's still a lot of good stuff to dig into during part 2 of his testimony. So if you missed the first part of Ian's testimony, it's in season 1, episode 45. You'll definitely want to take a listen before jumping into this episode.
And if it's been a minute, we'll give you a quick refresher of what we covered in the last episode. So basically, Ian Whiffin was brought in to explain that controversial 2:27 a.m. timestamp associated with that web history search on Jennifer McCabe's iPhone. During his testimony, he has walked the jury in the court through several key databases, the history.db, the browserstate.db, the mobilesafari.plist, and the KnowledgeC.db. He's explained how they work, what they record. So based on his testimony so far, you can conclude that his findings are that this 2:27 a.m. timestamp does not reflect when the searches were conducted. And he's given information that the actual searches were conducted at 6:23 and 6:24 a.m. And he also has established that those two searches have never successfully loaded, or they didn't successfully load. And he explained that's why they didn't show up in that history.db with the internet history. And he also explained that deleted browser state record, this record for the house long to die in the cold, was not user deleted, but was instead orphaned and cleaned up by the system. Yep. Like we said, we're halfway through. Sounds like he's done a lot of explaining, but there's more explaining to be done.
That's right. Now we get into that KnowledgeC.db. He describes it as deeply embedded in iOS 15. It logs essentially everything happening on the device at a system level when the screen backlight turns on. When the device is unlocked, of course, what application is in a foreground and for how long, which websites are visible on the screen at any given moment. He explains that in focus means the primary item visible to the user. You can have apps running in the background, but the one you're actively using is the one in focus.
So this leads us to Exhibit 621. Again, we'll have that link to all the exhibits in the show notes, so you can go and look at them. But Exhibit 621 is a document that he put together from the web usage logs that he discovered and analyzed that were in the KnowledgeC.db. So something to note here that within this database, the KnowledgeC.db, web usage data is going to be stored in a table called zObject. And then the artifact type that you're looking for in there is /app/web usage. So that's for our digital forensic examiners trying to keep track of what they should look for. So take note of that. Now, he also notes that the KnowledgeC organizes all the data in streams and that like information is grouped together. In the exhibit, he has some sections that are highlighted in green, and those green highlightings, they correspond to the entries from the time around 2:27 a.m. And again, that time is associated with that house long to die in the cold search. Now, I think everybody agrees that that search was typed in from everything we've heard. That's not in dispute. But in his testimony, Ian states that these records highlighted in green are what the KnowledgeC.db actually recorded as being visible on the screen at 2 a.m. And these URLs that are displayed in the exhibit are related to Ozone Basketball and Hockomock Sports. There's nothing displayed there that says anything about house long to die in cold.
Yep. He's asked directly, what were you able to determine about the timing of those searches based on your full analysis? And his answer is specific. At 2:27 a.m., the only websites visible on screen were Hockomock Sports and Ozone Basketball. The search, how long to die in cikd, first appeared on screen at 6:23 a.m. and House Long to Die in Cold, the second search, appeared on screen at 10:33 a.m. He also confirms that neither search appeared on screen at any point before 6:23 a.m. Okay, so whatever was happening at 2:27 a.m., it was not someone searching for information about house long to die in cold.
Whoa, did you guys catch that? There's been a new timestamp introduced. Ian Whiffin said 10:33 a.m. And he's talking about local time because everything else that he's been talking about has been local time. So this is new information being introduced, and it's new information regarding these searches, and it's specific to when they appeared on the screen. I went back and checked, the episodes about Jessica Hyde's testimony, and she didn't really discuss anything from her testimony about the KnowledgeC artifacts regarding the times that different web pages were present on the screen. Now, she did mention that there was the 3 a.m. recent web search artifact for how long to die in cikd with no URL present, and that search was coming from the com.apple.mobilesafari.plist. And then she mentioned two other timestamps from 6:23 at 56 seconds and 57 seconds, and that there was the Google search app web usage artifacts, again, for that same how long to die or how long to die in cikd, these search terms. But anyways, and that was coming from that Google URL. And that was also documented in the KnowledgeC database. And then she talked about at 6:24, there were some recent web search artifacts for the house long to die in cold from the Mobile Safari plist. And again, coming from the Google search of house long to die in cold with that Google URL being pointed out or documented in the KnowledgeC.db. So she never mentioned anything about a timestamp of 10:33, but she also didn't talk about anything and what time it was displayed on the screen to the user. I think that was maybe out of her scope based on her testimony. And remember, everything that we talked about so far, if you want to know what's on the screen, you have to look for that artifact related to in focus, and specifically in the KnowledgeC.db, you are looking for /app/in focus. I went through the exhibits. I didn't see a specific exhibit about in focus. So now we're kind of making this assumption that basically all of those web usage artifacts and the in focus artifacts align that are relevant to this case.
I'm wondering if there was much commentary about this 10:33 a.m. timestamp in other podcasts.
Yeah.
Or was everyone so intent on figuring out what the heck was happening with that the browser state.db is just sort of zipped by?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot about the timestamps in the news, right? People kind of tend to be on one side or the other. They think it means this or they think it means that. I've not really seen or heard anything about people harping on 10:33 a.m.
Right.
So we've got more testimony to go through, of course. Whiffin agreed with the prosecution that neither search ever appeared on the screen before 6:23 a.m. He was also asked what he concluded regarding the timestamp. And he said it's important to ignore that timestamp in the browser state DB because it's not a reliable timestamp to show when a URL is visited. And he also indicated that there are the mobile safari.plist records that show 624, coupled with other very similar timestamps for some of the same searches that were logged in the KnowledgeC.db. Now, he does mention that 10:33 a.m. timestamp for House Long to Die in Cold being on the screen at, 10:33 a.m. took a lot more explaining. So that sounds like it's more complicated than just, a simple timestamp being logged. And maybe we'll hear more about it during the trial. Who knows?
Now comes one of the more technical sections of his testimony, the write-ahead log or wall file. And so we want to spend a little time on this because it's the House Long to Die in Cold search record, which was recovered from the browser state.db. And try to understand it is important because, well, it can be tricky.
Yeah.
He explains that the SQLite database stores its data in pages. It's not something that the user ever sees. It's part of the structure of the SQLite databases. Just as chapters in a book can span multiple pages, data in a database can also span multiple pages. And it's not necessarily in the expected order. It's up to the database application to find those pages and order them correctly in order to display the data to the user. The wall file is a temporary holding area for changes to those pages, and it's organized into frames. Each frame contains a version of a page plus some identifying information at the top.
And we've got more. So every time a record is added, edited, or deleted, a new frame is written to the wall file. So over time, you can end up accumulating multiple frames that all contain different versions of the same page. Now, a normal database application reads only the most recent version of each page. So you only see what the app intends for you to see, and that makes sense. However, with forensic tools, we as examiners can dig deeper and take a look at some of those older versions of those frames, the pages, things of that nature. And because we can do that, this is how some deleted records can be recovered. And Ian Whiffin gives a clear example. He says if you have records 1, 2, and 3, and then you go back and delete record 2, the most recent page version will only show 1 and 3. And if you use your forensic software, you can dig in and go back to an earlier frame that still contained record 2. And so this is ultimately how that deleted browser state record was found. It existed in an older version of a page that was able to be recovered from the wall file.
So ask what is the relevance of only certain data only existing in the wall file, and his answer is, if I create a record that's in the wall file and delete it before it's committed, which means when it gets merged into the main database, then it exists only in the wall file. It could be that it's a brand new record that just hasn't been written yet, or it could be one that was deleted from the database prior to the commitment occurring. he was asked to explain what a commit is in database terms, and this is because it comes up in the context of how records can exist only in the wall. A commit is when the database takes all the most recent page versions from the wall, copies them into the main database file, and then deletes the wall file.
So if you're feeling confused about committing the commits, I think we got you covered here. So basically what it boils down to is any transaction for the database is going to be committed to the wall file. You can be adding a new record, you can be deleting an existing record, and then once that transaction is completed, then it's committed to the wall file. But then to Whiffin's point, that's how we have so many versions of the same record in the wall. The data in the wall is not going to be entered into the actual database until the checkpoint is reached. And so the checkpoint happens at a couple different occasions. It's either going to be because you hit a size limit or the app or the database is closed. And then when that checkpoint happens, the wall is cleared, whether it reaches the size limit or if it's closed, either way. And then once all that data is cleared out, that wall file is deleted.
Okay. So once a checkpoint occurs, the wall file is gone, and any deleted records that existed only in the wall frames are gone with it. If a record is created and deleted before that checkpoint happens, it might only ever exist in the wall file, never in the main database.
And so think about how you use your iPhone, right? Many of us just leave it on for days and days and days, so we're not shutting it down. And so these checkpoints are only going to happen if we're closing our apps. And sometimes we don't even do that very often. So we're kind of, a lot of instances, we're waiting for that file size limit to hit before these commits occur. So hopefully thinking about it like that, you can see how something may have only ever existed in the wall and never actually have shown up in the database. Hopefully this makes it maybe just murky water now instead of muddy water.
Starting to clear out.
Yeah. Now, back to his testimony. When he was asked about deleting data from the P list, he's clear that deleted data cannot be recovered from it. If a record is present in the P list, it hasn't been deleted. Now, regarding the history.db, he reiterates what he said earlier, that the record IDs are unbroken. There is no evidence of any deletion between January and February 2nd. And then regarding the KnowledgeC, he explains that the data is constantly being added and deleted by the system itself. None of that stuff happening in the KnowledgeC is at the user's discretion. And we can't say for sure what was deleted from the KnowledgeC, but you can see that during the times that Safari was being used, records exist within the KnowledgeC, and they seem to indicate that nothing was deleted.
So regarding deletions in the browserstate.db, he says it contained numerous deleted records. 3 records were recovered from the wall file, all with the timestamps very close to 2:27 and 40 seconds AM. When asked about the options for deleting data from the browser state database, Whiffin explained that the first and most prominent option is to delete absolutely everything from the device or delete all history from the device, which, as he mentioned, they knew didn't happen because other records still existed. So the only other real option is to delete selectively, which could mean deleting one at a time or deleting either the full day, in the last 2 days, or in the last hour. But in all of those cases, the record must exist in history.db in order to be deleted. Since the searches don't exist in the history.db, the user doesn't have the option to selectively delete it.
That makes sense. If it's not there, you can't do anything with it.
That's right.
Next, another exhibit. This one is 622, and these are some browserstate.db records, and there are some red lines documenting where one or more records have been deleted. Now, deleted in this case means that the application would not see the rec. So like the application doesn't know it existed. That's what that means. And he goes through and explains the columns, and he notes some of the different missing record IDs and asked, overall what he could determine from the dates and times of records 4024 and 4025. And if you look up the exhibit, it'll make a little more sense. But he stated that they matched when a tab was shown to the user. Next, he was asked what he could determine about records 4026 and 4027. And he said there was actually about 5 records within the browserstate.db with all within about 9 seconds around that 2:27 a.m. timestamp, with all sorts of sites being visited, going from PayPal to YouTube. And I think there was even some banking stuff. But anyways, he was next asked about spontaneous deletions. And he said that's not a term he'd use, but essentially it's a cleanup operation for records that aren't required anymore. He said that with his testing, he was not able to replicate any spontaneous deletions, but he was able to replicate orphaned records. Okay. I don't know. Becky, did we cover like what it means? Do you want to do that? Okay. So basically it's kind of like, in the parent-child relationship, if you think about people. Once you no longer have a parent as a person, you're an orphan. And so the same things. If you are a piece of data and whatever your parent was, whatever you belong to, if that's gone, now you're orphaned. And so we see it a lot in folders. Folders get orphaned. Folders get deleted, but then you can still recover parts of the files, and so they're orphaned files. And in this case, we've got records, parts of records that are being recovered from the database that are orphaned.
And so files in database, files in folders, files in a file system can end up being orphaned when they're deleted. There's no connection to any path. Yeah. So more exhibits related to Exhibit 622 are up next. Exhibit 623, Hockomock Sports entry in history.db related to that record 4026 from the browserstate.db that Whiffin just indicated was a deleted record. These are 2 history records from the evening of 127 to the Hockomock Sports website. Exhibit 624 shows visits to YouTube in the history.db related to the browserstate.db recovered through deleted record E47. These were visited in the afternoon of 127 and related to the It's Raining Men on YouTube. Exhibit 625 is entries from history.db for record 4029 from the browserstate.db, and it shows URLs related to Canton High School visited on the afternoon of 128. Exhibit 626 is entries from history.db for record 4030 from browserstate.db. It shows Ozone basketball was visited on 125 at 11:26 a.m.
So to kind of summarize what all of that means is, we have to remember that browserstate.db is keeping track of tabs. And so those records are keeping track of tabs. He's kind of backwards figured out what all that some of that session information was. And when he goes and correlates it to the history, you see a variety of websites. But I think the important thing to take away from these different websites that were being visited over time is that all of these dates were from before January 29th. And so I think that's the key takeaway there, in my opinion. Now, he was next asked about the totality of his analysis and what conclusions he came to in terms of the timing of the 2 searches in question. Whiffin stated, and I'm quoting, "In conclusion, I determined that the tab that was used was focused at 2:27:40 a.m. So the tab was opened at that time, at which point it was being used to show Ozone basketball and Hockomock Sports websites. The 6:23 a.m. timestamp is when the search was first conducted, It never loaded the page. Otherwise, there'd be a record for it in the history database. And while that page was still loading, a secondary search was conducted for house long to die in cold. Again, that page never loaded either, although both did show up in the KnowledgeC database to show that the browser was trying to display these pages. Safari was closed prior to House Long to Die in Cold was recorded being shown to the screen at all. But when it was reopened at 10:33 a.m. in regard to whatever other Safari activity was being conducted, it appeared on the screen. So basically what he was saying there is you have this 10:33 a.m. record where House Long to Die in Cold was finally shown on the screen, even though the page never successfully loaded. So we heard a little bit more about 10:33.
Right, absolutely. So when asked whether any of the data marked as deleted was actually user deleted or whether a user actively went through the process of deleting it, Whiffin stated, "We know that she didn't. We know that nobody deleted the entire history. So that leaves the only option to be selectively deleting records. The fact that there are no missing records in history shows that it's impossible that the user could have deleted that record. It could have just been orphaned in the database, and I believe would have deleted itself at some stage whenever a particular cleanup function ran. Although, as I said earlier, I haven't been able to replicate that." And that's Whiffin speaking.
And those orphan records he's talking about, again, are from that browserstate.db. And he's talking about that cleanup function running in or for or to, however you want to say it, to that browserstate.db. And when he's done in that last statement, if you look at, he's looked at what's happening between the two different databases, and really his testimony has been building this whole time regarding what was happening regarding those searches by using multiple artifacts along the way to explain what was going on.
Right. When asked if he reviewed the affidavit of Richard Green over the course of his analysis and testing, Whiffin confirmed he had and stated that he had issues with the several of the statements being made as part of the affidavit. When asked what those issues were, he stated, namely, it specified that the Cellebrite report identified that the search was conducted at 2:27:40 a.m. And as I've explained, as Whiffin is talking, I believe the tab took focus at 2:27:40, not when the search occurred. The report mentioned that the Cellebrite report identified it was deleted by the user. We don't do that. We'll tell you the record is deleted, but we don't specify how the record was deleted. That's something for the examiner to determine. And then there was a mention of the purpose of the browser state database. The explanation given was correct for iOS 14 and below, but not for iOS 15 and above, which is relevant in this case.
And then he mentions something which I think is really significant. He's asked about what Cellebrite has done about this timestamp. He said that Cellebrite itself has recognized that the browserstate.db timestamp, the one that we've been talking about for like almost 4 episodes now, well, and then 5 if you count the affidavit, right? So a lot of time. He says that they being Cellebrite, think the timestamp could be misleading, and they have made a decision to remove it from their output altogether. So the software now shows that a page has been visited, but it does not always attribute, or it simply does not attribute a time to it anymore. Specifically because, in his words, that timestamp could be wildly inaccurate. He said wildly. Those were his words. And so you have to look at this. This company makes a widely used digital forensic tool. Yep. A lot of people in law enforcement. And Cellebrite looked at this timestamp and they decided it was too unreliable to display. So it's not a minor footnote, not something to breeze over really. But as examiners, you still have to remember that this timestamp still exists. And so if you or the opposing examiner is manually digging into the data and reviewing the raw contents of the database, they will see it. So we don't just get to forget all about this artifact.
Exactly. So next up is a live demonstration. Before the demonstration begins, the judge addresses the jury directly. She instructs them that what they're about to see is simply a demonstration to help them understand the evidence in this case. It is not itself evidence, and they must decide the case based on the evidence presented to them. The lawyer then asks Whiffin whether he was able to prepare a demonstration related to what he's been discussing throughout his testimony, and he says yes. The lawyer then walks through a couple of clarifying points with him before they start. He confirms that the demonstration doesn't specifically reflect the searches or the extraction report from this case, and Whiffin agrees with that. The lawyer then asks whether the demonstration does address the overall issue he's been discussing throughout his testimony, and Whiffin confirms that it does. So the jury hopefully understands going into this that it is not a recreation of what happened on the phone in question. It's an illustration of how the technology behaves.
So Whiffin then shows his iPhone screen live in the courtroom. It's being projected on the big screen. So the jury can see it, the courtroom can see it. And on the other half of the screen, he's got his ArtEx tool. And he takes a moment to explain that what ArtEx is doing. It basically has a feature that allows you to see the files from a connected device in near real time. So it basically maps or syncs or copies, whatever word you want to use, those folders and files to your computer. And then he explains that this is useful because it increases the speed. So instead of having to conduct a full extraction every time you want to check something, you can simply refresh and then pull the most current version of the files down directly from the phone, directly to your computer. So now he is navigating to the copy of the phone files that are present on his computer. He navigates straight to the browserstate.db and opens it and shows the jury that at this moment there are no records in it.
He then provides the context for what they're about to see. He explains that he has Safari open on his phone from the night before at 8:10 the previous evening. He opened a brand new tab in Safari and performed a search. And that tab is still open on his phone right now in the courtroom. He chose his search terms deliberately. He searched for the date and time, which makes it easy to track and document, rather than using something generic like test 1 or test 2. The time and date are essentially built right into the search results so that you can follow along clearly.
And then he performs a live search for the current time. So he's in Safari and he searches for 1442 so the jury can see a real search being conducted in real time. So after that search is done, he goes back into ArtEx and hits the reload button. And then with that press of the button, ArtEx deletes the copy of the database that's on his computer and it pulls the most recent copy down from the phone and puts it on his computer. He opens it up again. He shows the jury the result. It still shows no records in the browserstate.db. Still empty. Nothing has changed. And here he explains why. He explains that this is expected behavior because he has not closed this tab yet. The search was conducted, but the tab is still open. Yep. And then he draws the direct comparison. So he says, if it was iOS 14, then there'd already be a record in the browserstate.db showing that this tab is open. But iOS 15 doesn't work that way, and records only get written when a tab is closed.
So to make sure the jury sees the entire process, he goes back to Safari and closes the window. Then he goes back into ArtEx and hits reload again. And this time, records appear in the browserstate.db. He pulls up the newly presented record and walks the jury through what it shows. The title of the record reflects the 1442 search, Google search, the one he just conducted moments ago in the courtroom. He points out that the Google search record is right there, but then he draws their attention to the last viewed time field. and it still shows 8:10 p.m. from the night before, not 14:42, not the time of the search he just did. 8:10 p.m., the time he originally opened that tab the previous evening, because that is when the tab first took focus. The timestamp reflects when the tab was focused, not when any search within that tab was conducted.
And with that concludes his direct examination. And I mean, wow, like a live demonstration in court, Becky. Live, you and I both know live demos are always risky, no matter when or where, no matter how much you prep. But to do this in open court,
that's brave.
Yes, very brave. I am curious as to whose idea it was to do this demo. Based on the instructions, I bet there was a little bit of heated debate behind the scenes. But to reiterate, what was the purpose of this demo? It was to show when that timestamp gets updated. Even as an examiner, I thought this demo, like, really, it was a nice walkthrough to see it happening real time. So if you're a visual person, it kind of makes it more tangible. Some stuff you can see on the screen. He was using an iPhone 6S running iOS 15.8.2. So that's a little bit newer version than McCabe's phone. The file names are kind of hard to read on the screen, but you can see he's in the folder that contains the browserstate.db, so you can make the assumptions the other files present are the wall and the dot.
Now we move into cross-examination. The defense starts by getting into how Whiffin became involved in the case, and it was because the timestamps didn't make sense to investigators. And he agrees with that characterization. The defense then asks whether Trooper Proctor was one of the investigators on the case, and Whiffin says he doesn't recall any names specifically because the case came to him through another Cellebrite examiner rather than directly from law enforcement.
The defense shifts then to the demonstration itself and starts pressing on the question of whether or not it was truly a fair comparison. They ask Whiffin whether, when conducting a demonstration, you would want it to be as close as possible to the real conditions, essentially an apples-to-apples comparison. And Whiffin agrees with that principle. Then the defense gets specific about the iOS versions. He asked Whiffin what versions he tested, and he said he tested versions 12 through 17 and even a beta version of 18. And then, as I just mentioned, this demo was actually conducted on a device running 15.8.2. And then the defense points out that the phone in this case from Jennifer McCabe's phone was running 15.2.2. And he agrees that he's aware of that. And then the defense asks whether the way an artifact is stored on an iPhone can depend on a specific iOS version. Whiffin agrees that it can. And he also agrees that he didn't use the same version, though he mentioned it was the closest version he could get his hands on.
The defense then moves to the deleted browser state record, asks Whiffin directly, was the 2:27 a.m. record deleted? Whiffin says yes. The defense then asks whether he was able to recover the data contained in that record. Whiffin confirms that he was. He recovered the 2:27 a.m. timestamp and the Google search URL for House Long to Die in Cold. The defense then asks specifically about the session history, and Whiffin agrees that he was not able to recover that. So the record itself was recovered, but the session history associated with it was not. The defense asks whether Whiffin conducted his demonstration using a different operating system than the one running on the phone in this case. Whiffin agrees that he did.
He was then asked about whether his own testing produced a situation where a WAL file contained a deleted record and the session history was not recoverable. He says yes. He explains that in the instance, the session was so large that some of the pages had been overwritten, which is why the session history couldn't be recovered. He's then asked whether he was able to recreate the other deletions, the other records that appeared as deleted in his exhibit, not just the one tied to the House Long to Die in Cold search. Whiffin stated that in his testing, when he selectively deleted items from history, those items were also removed from the browserstate.db. So he was able to replicate that behavior.
Okay. Whiffin continues that there are 5 possible methods for deletion, and he ruled out 4 of them during his testimony today. That leaves 2 user deletion and another method that isn't fully understood, and that Whiffin himself has said he can't replicate. The defense states if 4 methods are ruled out and 1 can't be replicated or explained, then the only method left is user deletion. Whiffin's response is equally plain that that is not the case. That is not in this case.
The defense follows up by asking Whiffin to agree that selective deletion means the user selects what they want to delete, and he agrees, and then he's asked to describe who the user is, and Whiffin says it's whoever's using the iPhone itself. The defense asks another pointed question. Would Whiffin agree that someone who had access to the data before the extractions were made, could they have performed selective deletions of that data? There's an objection. The judge allows it. And then Whiffin's answer is no.
The defense then asks whether Whiffin is familiar with an application called MySQL. He says he is. The defense then asks whether someone with access to that application could use it to make selective deletions. Whiffin explains that if someone had the extraction, they could technically remove a file, alter it, and then replace it, but he notes that the hash values would document that a change had been made. In other words, it wouldn't be invisible. There would be a detectable record of the alteration.
Next, he's asked whether someone could renumber the data in the history.db and the KnowledgeC to cover their tracks. Whiffin says it could theoretically be done, but that it would require a significant level of knowledge and skill to do it in a way that wasn't detectable.
And we are nearly at the end. It's time for the redirect. The prosecution comes back and asks about the iOS version discrepancy, specifically whether the difference between the version of the demonstration device and the version on McCabe's phone has any impact on what Whiffin showed the jury. He answers that in every iOS version 12 and 18 that he tested, the last view time was consistently been recorded as the time the tab took focus. That behavior has not changed across versions, so the version difference does not affect the conclusion he drew from his demonstration.
Regarding the question of selective deletion, he reiterates his position. There is no evidence of selective deletion in this case, and he points back to the same foundational facts that he established earlier. The row IDs in the history DB are unbroken. There's no missing records. If a selective deletion had occurred, there would be gaps, and there are none.
On the hash values, the defense raised the possibility that someone could have tampered with the data. The prosecution asks Whiffin about that directly. He says he did not have access to the hash values in this case. He did not see anything in the data that would indicate tampering had occurred. He acknowledges that it could be possible, but he is unclear that it would require a considerable level of skill and expertise to carry out without leaving a detectable trace.
And then the prosecution asked him perhaps one of the most important questions of his testimony. What is his opinion as to when those Google searches were actually conducted? He says he has no doubt that they were conducted at 6:23 and 6:24 a.m. on the morning of January 29th.
And that is the conclusion of Ian Whiffin's testimony. So we've covered a lot of ground across these 2 episodes, dates and times regarding the how long to die in the cold and how long to die in KDD, to the basics of how SQLite databases work, to WAL files and deleted records, and even a live demonstration conducted in open court. Stacy, what do you want to go back and discuss?
Well, I think I want to talk more about the lawyers a little bit here at the end and their questioning, because, I think a lot of the first half of his testimony is just, Ian Whiffin is getting the facts and he's talking about all the things. And then kind of towards the last half, there's a little bit of new information coming in, But now the lawyer is asking him for his opinions and his conclusions. So he's reiterating those facts again, but in a much shorter form, so he could share basically the key takeaways. So he's like, it's kind of like, hey, jury, I've been talking for a long time, probably a couple hours at this point. And so the lawyer is getting him to be like, what does this all mean? He's sharing that. So like, especially that very last question at the end, basically, when were those Google searches conducted? He says 623 and 624. He's got a lot of, the lawyer did a lot of good job of asking great questions to clarify what does all of this gobbledygook mean.
Yeah. And I think that the slow, methodical way of handling this technical testimony is the right way to do it, because with a repeat of questions, with a repeat of steps, with a methodology put together, and then doing a live demonstration, and it being successful, you're seeing what he's doing to come to these conclusions.
And he never once said, well, in terms of like, he wasn't ever quoting like, well, Cellebrite said, or Axiom said, or this other tool said. He was explaining what he found, what his analysis said, what his testing said all along the way. And in terms of time, the defense and their cross-examination wasn't really too long at all. They tended to ask a lot of their questions of, wouldn't you agree with me? I think that was kind of a lot of their questions. They want you to agree with them. And they're of course trying to demonstrate what they believe happened and get you to say that, like, I don't know, they're trying to get you to be like, oh, everything I just said is wrong, right? That's kind of what they want to say if your position is not supporting their position. But they didn't cut him off right away. They let him explain, like, oh, I deleted more than just, or I tested more than just, the one version that didn't match. I went backwards in time and I went forwards in time of what's been released, and they all had the same behavior. So I think that was very good for him to get in again with the defense, asking those questions. But then again, also, when he said, well, wouldn't you like to have the apples to apples? He agrees. And he also agreed that it wasn't the exact same version. So, and he didn't he wasn't unprofessional. He wasn't snippy about it. He's just like, these are the facts. And that's always the approach that we have to take with these things, because there are times where this is our conclusion, and just like what Jessica said with like about the whatever the panda comment was, sure, there's this slim chance, sure it could happen, and that's just how some of it goes.
That's right. Well, join us every week on Thursday as we continue to dive into Karen Reed's first trial. If you've enjoyed this episode, we're just asking you to do us a favor and share this with your network. Leave us a review wherever you listen. It helps new listeners to find us. So until next time, stay safe, stay sharp, and as always, keep parsing the truth one bite at a time.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us to get notified the next time a new episode drops. If you can do more, head on over to parsingthetruth.com and donate by clicking on the donate button. Parsing the Truth is a nonprofit organization, and we are raising money to send a new digital forensic examiner to IASIS training next year in Orlando. Thanks.